At the airport, my wife said, "Don't walk with me. You'll embarrass me in front of my rich friends." I nodded and let her go ahead. But when she came back weeks later, her ride home wasn't me. Let me tell you about the morning that changed everything. My name is Marcus Hale, and I'm about to take you through the most spectacularly humiliating moment of my marriage, which, spoiler alert, also turned out to be the most liberating. Picture this. It's 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'm dragging 3 suitcases that could probably house a small family through the airport. And I'm wondering how the hell my wife managed to pack what looks like half of Nordstrom for a 3-week content creation trip to Europe. Now, before you start thinking I'm some kind of saint for slinging her luggage around like a pack mule, let me paint you the full picture. Sophie had been planning this trip for months. And by planning, I mean she'd been dropping not so subtle hints about needing new outfits, professional camera equipment, and inspiration funds for her influencer career. Translation: I'd been funding this European adventure to the tune of about 15 grand. Not that anyone was keeping track. Well, except me, because somebody had to pay the credit card bills. I showed up that morning in my standard airport attire. Dark jeans, a comfortable hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days but were broken in just right. Look, I'm not trying to impress anyone at 5:30 in the morning. Especially not the TSA agents who look like they'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth. I figured I'd drop Sophie off, grab some coffee, maybe hit the gym on my way home. Simple, straightforward, no drama. But then Sophie's traveling companions arrived, and suddenly I felt like I'd wandered onto the set of some reality show about rich housewives. Clara and Vivon swept in like they were walking a red carpet instead of navigating the departure zone at LAX. Clara was sporting what I'm pretty sure was a designer outfit that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, complete with sunglasses that probably had their own insurance policy. Vivon wasn't far behind, clicking across the pavement in heels that looked like they could double as weapons, dragging a suitcase that screamed, "I have more money than sense." Now, I've met these women before at Sophie's little get-togethers. And let me tell you, they have a special talent for making you feel like you're about 2 tax brackets below their notice. They do this thing where they smile at you with their mouths, but their eyes are calculating your net worth and finding it sadly lacking. It's like being evaluated by a pair of well-dressed vultures. The moment Clara and Vivon laid eyes on me, I could practically see the gears turning. Here I was, Sophie's husband, looking like I just rolled out of bed to do manual labor, standing next to their friend who was about to embark on this fabulous European adventure. The looks they exchanged, man, if looks could kill, I'd have been a dead man walking. But the real kicker wasn't their barely concealed disdain. I'd dealt with that before, chalked it up to their snobbery, and moved on with my life. No, the moment that's burned into my brain like a brand happened when Sophie caught sight of her friend's reactions. I watched her face change in real time, saw the exact second she registered their disapproval, and decided to distance herself from the source of their judgment. Me, her husband, the guy who'd been supporting her dreams, funding her lifestyle, and hauling her oversized luggage through an airport at dawn. She stepped closer to me and for a split second I thought she was going to introduce me properly, maybe say something nice about how I'd driven her to the airport or helped organize her trip. Instead, she leaned in close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, the stuff I bought her for Christmas, and whispered 6 words that hit me like a punch to the gut. "Don't walk with me. You'll embarrass me." Let me repeat that because I want to make sure you caught the full impact. My wife, the woman I'd been married to for 4 years, the person I'd been supporting emotionally and financially while she chased her influencer dreams, told me not to walk with her because I would embarrass her in front of her rich friends. Not, "Thanks for the ride, honey," or "I'll miss you or even see you in 3 weeks. Just a cold, calculated dismissal designed to preserve her image with 2 women who probably wouldn't remember my name if their lives depended on it. Now, I could have made a scene. I could have raised my voice, demanded an explanation, maybe even given Clara and Vivian a piece of my mind about their judgment and attitude. I could have reminded Sophie right there in front of her precious friends about all the ways I'd been supporting her, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the times I'd bitten my tongue when she prioritized her image over our relationship. But you know what I did instead? I looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her and I saw something I'd been trying to ignore for months. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a case of nerves about traveling with her intimidating friends. This was who Sophie really was when push came to shove. This was her true priority system laid bare. Image first, everything else a distant second. So, I let go of her luggage cart. Just opened my hands and let it roll away from me. I nodded once. The kind of calm, measured nod you give when you've just made an important decision. And I turned around and walked away. No argument, no dramatic declaration, no tearful goodbye. I just left her standing there with her designer friends and her overpacked suitcases and her carefully constructed image. As I walked back toward the parking structure, I could hear Sophie calling my name, but her voice had that sharp edge of panic that told me she was starting to realize she might have overplayed her hand. Too little, too late, sweetheart. I'd spent 4 years being the reliable, supportive husband who showed up when needed and faded into the background when convenient. I'd been her safety net, her financial backing, her emotional support system, and apparently her embarrassment. The drive home was the quietest 45 minutes of my life, and not because I was devastated or heartbroken. I was calm in a way I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally stopped carrying a weight I didn't realize had been crushing me. Sophie thought she'd be coming home in 3 weeks to the same old Marcus, the guy who'd take whatever scraps of respect she threw his way and be grateful for them. She had absolutely no idea that her life, our life, was about to be completely rewritten. And for the first time in a very long time, I was looking forward to being the one holding the pen. You know what's funny about life-changing moments? Everyone expects them to come with dramatic music and slow-motion sequences like some kind of Hollywood breakdown scene. But the drive home from LAX that morning was the complete opposite of chaos. It was the clearest my head had been in years. While other drivers were losing their minds in typical LA traffic, honking and weaving like maniacs, I was cruising in the right lane, windows down, actually enjoying the 45 minutes it took to get back to our house in Manhattan Beach. The thing is, I wasn't plotting revenge or rehearsing angry speeches in my head. That's what Sophie would expect because that's how her drama-filled brain works. She probably figured I'd spend the next 3 weeks stewing in my hurt feelings. Maybe calling her friends to complain. Definitely waiting by the phone for her to throw me some breadcrumb apology from Paris or Rome. Classic Marcus behavior, right? The reliable guy who always forgives and forgets because he's too nice to rock the boat. But here's what Sophie never understood about me. I'm not nice. I'm strategic. There's a difference. Nice guys let people walk all over them and then wonder why they're always getting screwed. Strategic guys. We take notes. We remember every slight, every dismissal, every moment when someone shows us exactly who they are and then we act accordingly. See, while I was hauling her luggage through that airport, getting dismissed like the hired help, my brain was already 3 steps ahead. Sophie thought she was married to some pushover who'd built his whole identity around making her happy. What she actually married was a guy who'd spent 6 years in the army before college. Learned how to think under pressure and knew the difference between a tactical retreat and surrender. The SUV she loved so much. That gleaming black Escalade she used for all her Instagram photos. The one that made her feel like a celebrity when she pulled up to those fancy Beverly Hills brunches with Clara and Vivian. That baby was titled in my name only. Bought and paid for with my money, my credit, my signature on the paperwork. Sophie always assumed joint ownership because, well, we were married and she drove it more than I did. But assumption is the mother of all screw-ups, and Sophie was about to get a master class in the difference between assumption and reality. I pulled into our driveway, or rather my driveway, since the house was also in my name, thanks to an inheritance from my grandfather, and sat there for a minute, engine running, looking at the place we'd called home for the past 2 years. Sophie had spent months decorating it with her aesthetic, turning every room into a backdrop for her social media content. The living room looked like a furniture showroom, all white and beige and completely impractical. The kitchen had more camera equipment than cooking supplies. Even our bedroom had special lighting installed so she could film her morning routines. It hit me then that I'd been living in a movie set, not a home. Every decision about paint, colors, furniture, decor, all of it filtered through the lens of how will this look online. I couldn't remember the last time we'd chosen something because we actually liked it because it made us comfortable. Because it reflected who we were as people instead of who Sophie wanted her followers to think we were. But that was about to change because Marcus 2.0 was about to make his debut. And this version of me had zero patience for Sophie's carefully curated. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First stop, the Cadillac dealership where I'd bought the Escalade 18 months ago. You'd be amazed how cooperative car dealers get when you mention you're thinking about selling back a low-mileage luxury vehicle. Within 20 minutes, I had an appointment for that afternoon and a rough estimate that made me smile. Sophie's precious status symbol was about to become a very nice check with my name on it. While I was on a roll, I called my buddy Jake who works in real estate. Not because I was thinking about selling the house. Hell no. I love that house. Or at least I loved what it could become once I stripped away all of Sophie's Instagram-friendly nonsense. But Jake knows everyone in town, including the best junk removal services. The kind of guys who can clear out a house fast and don't ask too many questions about why you need 3 rooms worth of designer clothes and makeup removed ASAP. Let me guess, Jake said when I explained what I needed. Sophie finally pushed you too far. Something like that. I told him, can you hook me up with someone reliable? I'm talking full service. Everything that isn't nailed down and doesn't belong to me. Gone by tomorrow. Damn, brother. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years. Yeah, I got a guy. Tommy's crew will take care of you. And they're discreet. Cash only, though. Not a problem. The beautiful thing about having a plan is how it simplifies everything else. While Sophie was probably boarding her first-class flight to London, posting selfies about how excited she was for her European adventure, I was systematically dismantling the foundation of her comfortable little world. And the best part, I was doing it all completely legally, using only resources that belonged to me in the first place. The Escalade sale went smoother than I expected. Turns out luxury SUVs hold their value pretty well when they've been garage kept and babied by someone who only drove them to yoga classes and brunch spots. The dealer cut me a check for 38 grand, which was about 6,000 less than I'd paid, but still enough to make Sophie's head spin when she found out. I deposited the money in my personal account, the one she didn't have access to, and felt a deep satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. On the drive home in my old pickup truck, the one Sophie always complained was too blue-collar for her image, I started thinking about what came next. This wasn't just about revenge, though. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. This was about reclaiming my life from someone who'd been systematically erasing me from it. Sophie wanted to be embarrassed by me. Fine, she could be embarrassed from a distance while I rebuilt everything she tried to change about who I was. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, the sun was setting and I felt more like myself than I had in years. Tomorrow, Tommy's crew would arrive and start clearing out 4 years' worth of Sophie stuff. The day after that, I'd start turning our house back into my home. And in 3 weeks, when Sophie's European vacation ended, and she expected to find me waiting with open arms and a full bank account, she'd discover that some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt. Phase 1 was complete. Sophie's precious SUV was gone, converted into cold, hard cash that would fund whatever came next. She taught me an important lesson that morning at the airport. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most willing to throw you under the bus to protect their image. Lucky for me, I'm a fast learner. Waking up in my own house the next morning felt like opening my eyes in someone else's life. Everywhere I looked, Sophie's presence screamed at me from every corner, every surface, every carefully curated inch of what used to be our home. The massive walk-in closet that looked like a Saks Fifth Avenue explosion with designer dresses still bearing tags from impulse purchases she'd made for content. The bathroom counter that resembled a Sephora stock room covered in skincare serums and makeup palettes that cost more than most people's rent. The guest room that had been completely transformed into her filming studio, complete with professional lighting rigs, camera equipment, and a backdrop wall sheet had custom painted in what she called millennial pink, but I called Pepto-Bismol nightmare for years of marriage. And somehow Sophie had managed to colonize every square foot of my grandfather's house with her brand. Even the kitchen, for crying out loud, had been redesigned around her morning routine videos. Special lighting installed above the island, a collection of aesthetically pleasing but completely useless appliances arranged for maximum visual impact, and a coffee station that looked like it belonged in a boutique cafe rather than a place where people actually lived. But here's the thing about military training that most people don't understand. It teaches you to see problems as logistics exercises, and Sophie's stuff that was just a logistics problem waiting for the right solution. Tommy's crew showed up at 8 a.m. sharp. 3 guys in matching uniforms driving a truck that could have hauled a small apartment. The crew chief, a no-nonsense guy with graying temples and arms like tree trunks, took one look around the house and let out a low whistle. "Damn, buddy. Your wife really went all out, didn't she?" "Ex-wife," I corrected, even though the paperwork wasn't filed yet. "And yeah, she had expensive taste. Lucky for you, most of it's barely been used." Tommy walked through each room with me, taking notes on his clipboard while I pointed out what stayed and what went. It was actually pretty simple. If I'd bought it, chosen it, or inherited it from my family, it stayed. Everything else was fair game. The distinction was clearer than I'd expected. Probably because Sophie and I had such different ideas about what made a house feel like home. "What about this stuff?" Tommy asked, gesturing to the filming equipment in the guest room. "Some of this gear looks pretty high-end." "All of it goes," I said. "The cameras, the lights, the backdrop, that ridiculous pink chair she bought for her talking head videos. I want this room completely empty." "You sure about that? Some of this equipment's worth serious money. You could probably sell it yourself, make a decent profit." I thought about it for maybe half a second. Yeah, I could have spent weeks dealing with online listings, meeting potential buyers, negotiating prices, but that would mean thinking about Sophie's career, her content, her brand for hours every day. That would mean staying connected to the life she'd built using my money and my support. No, thanks. Take it all, I told him. Whatever you guys can't use, donate it or dump it. I just want it gone. While Tommy's crew got to work, I tackled the digital side of Sophie's empire. See, here's something she never knew about me. I actually understand technology pretty well. Those years in the army included some time working with communication systems, which translated surprisingly well to civilian IT work. Sophie always treated me like I was some kind of caveman when it came to computers. But that was just another way she'd underestimated me. I started with the easy stuff, changing passwords on all the accounts that were actually mine, but that she'd been using. Our joint banking accounts, the credit cards, the streaming services, even the Wi-Fi network. Sophie was about to discover that her comfortable digital life had been built on infrastructure she didn't control and couldn't access without me. But the real masterstroke was her website. Sophie's influencer career depended on her carefully maintained online presence. And the crown jewel was her personal website, the hub where she directed followers from Instagram and TikTok, where brands could find her contact information and portfolio, where she sold her courses and affiliate links. What she didn't know was that the hosting account, the domain registration, and the admin access were all tied to my email address because I'd been the one to set it up for her 2 years ago. I didn't delete anything. That would have been too obvious, too petty. Instead, I changed the admin password and quietly took control of the back end. For now, everything looked normal from the outside, but I was sitting on a digital nuclear option that could vaporize her online presence with a few clicks whenever I decided the time was right. The physical clearing of the house took most of the day, and it was weirdly therapeutic to watch 4 years of accumulated Sophie disappear into Tommy's truck. Her closet full of designer clothes that she bought for Instagram posts and then never wore again. Gone. The collection of expensive handbags she rotated through like some kind of fashion conveyor belt. Gone. The mountains of skincare products she'd accumulated from brand partnerships and PR packages. Gone. Even the furniture she'd insisted we buy to match her aesthetic. The uncomfortable white couches that looked great in photos but felt like sitting on cardboard. All of it loaded up and hauled away. By the time Tommy and his crew finished, the house felt like it had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. The spaces were empty, but not hollow. They were clean slates waiting for me to decide what came next. The guest room, stripped of its filming equipment and pink backdrop, revealed windows I'd forgotten existed and hardwood floors that had been hidden under Sophie's equipment for so long they looked brand new. You want a receipt for all this? Tommy asked as his crew loaded the last of Sophie's exercise equipment, a Peloton bike she'd used maybe 6 times, into the truck. Absolutely, I said. Something told me I was going to want documentation of exactly what had been removed and when. As the truck pulled away, I stood in my driveway looking at a house that was finally mine again. Empty rooms, quiet spaces, no ring lights or camera equipment, or strategically placed props designed to create the illusion of a perfect life. For the first time in years, I could walk through my own home without feeling like I was trespassing on someone else's movie set. Sophie was probably in London by now, posting stories about her 5-star hotel room and expensive dinners. She had no idea that back home, her carefully constructed world was being systematically dismantled by the husband she'd dismissed as an embarrassment. Tomorrow, I'd start rebuilding. Tonight, I was just going to enjoy the silence. Walking back into that house after selling Sophie's precious SUV felt like entering enemy territory. Every corner, every room, every damn surface screamed her name louder than a teenager at a buoyant concert. It was like living inside her Instagram feed. All carefully arranged props and staged moments. Nothing real or authentic about any of it. The living room looked like a furniture catalog threw up all over my space with throw pillows arranged in geometric patterns that nobody was actually allowed to disturb because they might mess up the aesthetic. The master bedroom was basically a film studio disguised as a place where people sleep. Ring lights positioned at strategic angles. A whole setup for her morning routine videos where she'd pretend to wake up naturally while wearing full makeup. The bathroom looked like Sephora had exploded. Skincare products covering every inch of counter space, most of them half-as used and abandoned when she moved on to the next miracle serum her influencer friends were pushing. And don't even get me started on the walk-in closet that had become Sophie's personal Nordstrom, packed with designer clothes that still had tags on them because she bought them for specific posts and then forgot they existed. But the guest room, man, that was the real kicker. What used to be my workshop, the place where I'd built furniture and worked on projects that actually meant something to me, had been completely transformed into Sophie's content creation headquarters. Professional cameras, lighting equipment, a whole backdrop system for different moods, and enough ring lights to illuminate a small stadium. She'd shoved all my tools and half-finished projects into the garage, claiming she needed the space for her business. Looking at it all that morning, I realized I'd been living in someone else's fantasy for way too long. This wasn't our home. It was Sophie's stage set, and I was just the unpaid maintenance crew keeping the lights on and the bills paid. Time for some renovations. I called Tommy's crew first thing, and let me tell you, these guys were exactly what Jake had promised. Efficient, professional, and completely uninterested in the drama behind why someone would want to clear out half a house in 24 hours. Tommy himself showed up around noon to do the walkthrough. A guy in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by any of it. "So, what are we talking about here?" he asked, surveying the living room with the practiced eye of someone who dealt with plenty of domestic situations gone sideways. "Everything that's not mine," I told him. "Clothes, makeup, all that filming equipment, furniture that screams, 'Look at me. I'm expensive.' Basically, anything that wouldn't be here if I lived alone." Tommy nodded, making notes on his clipboard. "What about stuff that might be worth something? Designer bags, jewelry, electronics. Box it up separately and put it in storage. I'll get her the address later." See, I'm not a complete bastard. I wasn't going to throw her Louis Vuitton collection in a dumpster, much as the idea had its appeal. But I also wasn't going to keep living in a museum dedicated to her vanity and the furniture. I looked around at the white leather sectional that cost more than my truck, the glass coffee table that was completely useless for actually putting coffee on, the decorative chair that looked like modern art, but was about as comfortable as sitting on a pile of rocks. Donate what's in good shape. Dump the rest. I want this place to look like a normal human being lives here, not like a magazine shoot gone wrong. Double rate for 24-hour turnaround. Worth every penny. While Tommy's crew started strategically dismantling Sophie's carefully curated world, I tackled the digital side of things. This was where my years in the army came in handy. When you're trained in logistics and systems, you learn to think about the connections between things, the dependencies that people don't always see. Sophie's whole influencer empire ran on accounts and platforms that she'd never bothered to secure properly. See, when you're married to someone and you trust them completely, you tend to use their information for backup recovery options. Email addresses, phone numbers, security questions. Sophie had been sloppy about keeping our digital lives separate because she never imagined a scenario where that might matter. First stop, all our joint accounts, checking, savings, credit cards, anything with both our names on it got locked down faster than a military base during a security breach. I changed passwords, removed her access, and set up new accounts that only I controlled. Not stealing her money, mind you, just making sure she couldn't drain our joint resources while she was living it up in Europe on my dime. Then came the fun part, her precious website and social media empire. Sophie had built her whole brand around being this aspirational lifestyle guru, posting about her perfect marriage, her beautiful home, her enviable life. What she'd forgotten was that I'd helped set up most of her technical infrastructure, including being listed as the administrator on her main website, not out of any grand plan, just because I was handy with computers, and she couldn't be bothered to learn how domain registration worked. Now, I didn't delete anything that would be too obvious and probably illegal. But I became what you might call a silent partner in Sophie's brand management. Every post, every update, every carefully staged photo would now have to go through systems I controlled. I wasn't planning to sabotage her immediately. That would be too easy and not nearly satisfying enough. No, I was playing a longer game here. By evening, Tommy's crew had worked some kind of magic. The house was unrecognizable, stripped of all Sophie's Instagram-ready nonsense and reduced to the basic furniture and belongings that were actually mine. The guest room was empty and echoing. Ready to become my workshop again. The bathroom looked like a normal human being used it instead of a beauty YouTuber. The bedroom had actual function again instead of being a broadcast studio. Standing in the living room at sunset, looking at walls that weren't covered in Sophie's motivational quotes and surfaces that weren't cluttered with her ring lights and camera equipment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. This was my space again, ready to be shaped by what I actually wanted instead of what would photograph well for social media. The house felt bigger somehow, like removing all of Sophie's stuff had given me room to breathe again. Tomorrow, I'd start the fun part, turning this empty canvas back into a home that reflected who I actually was instead of who Sophie needed me to be for her brand. Phase 2 complete. Sophie's physical presence had been surgically removed from my life with the precision of a military operation. In 3 weeks, she'd come home expecting to find everything exactly as she'd left it. She was going to be very, very disappointed. Waking up in an empty house should have felt depressing. But honestly, it was like Christmas morning for my soul. No ring lights glaring at me from 3 different angles. No camera equipment cluttering up every surface. No carefully arranged throw pillows that I wasn't allowed to actually throw anywhere. Just space, beautiful, functional mine again, space that I could fill with things that actually mattered to me instead of props for Sophie's endless content creation circus. The first thing I did was head straight to the garage where all my real stuff had been banished like some kind of furniture refugee camp. You know what I found buried under a tarp behind Sophie's bike that she'd ridden exactly twice for Instagram photos? My oak coffee table, the one I'd built with my own hands 3 years ago from reclaimed what I'd salvaged from an old barn outside Bakersfield. Sophie had hated that table with the passion of 1,000 suns because it didn't fit her aesthetic. Too rustic, too handmade, too much personality. She'd made me replace it with some glass monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room and cost more than most people's monthly rent. Hauling the oak table back into the living room felt like reuniting with an old friend. I ran my hands over the surface, checking for damage, but the wood had held up beautifully. This table had character grain patterns that told a story, small imperfections that proved it was made by human hands instead of stamped out in some factory. You could actually put things on it without Sophie shrieking about water rings or scratches. Revolutionary concept, right? Next came the fun part. Furniture shopping for someone who actually planned to live in his house instead of just filming in it. I hit up a local place in Rundo Beach that specialized in real furniture for real people. Comfortable couches you could nap on, coffee tables that could handle a beer and a pizza box. Chairs that prioritized sitting over looking pretty in photos. The sales guy, Steve, was probably wondering why I seemed so excited about buying a sectional that was designed for comfort instead of aesthetics, but I didn't care. After years of living in Sophie's magazine spread, I was ready for furniture that served a purpose beyond looking good in selfies. The new couch was this amazing deep brown leather thing that actually invited you to sit down and stay a while. None of that white leather nonsense that showed every speck of dust and made you afraid to exist in your own living room. This was a couch for watching football, taking naps, and maybe even eating takeout without having to worry about dropping sauce on something that cost more than a car payment. While I was at it, I picked up a sound system that could actually handle music instead of just serving as a backdrop for Sophie's morning routine videos. I'm talking about speakers that could make you feel the bass line in your chest. The kind of setup that turns your living room into your own personal concert hall. Sophie had always complained that real music was too distracting when she was filming, so we'd been stuck with whatever ambient noise played well for her content. Screw that noise. Literally, the transformation was happening fast. But the real magic happened when Logan showed up around 6 with a cooler full of beer and a grin that could power the entire city of Los Angeles. Logan had been my best friend since college. The kind of guy who'd tell you the truth even when you didn't want to hear it, especially about your wife, who clearly didn't deserve you. He'd been biting his tongue about Sophie for years. But I could see in his face that those days were officially over. "Holy Marcus," he said, walking into the living room and doing a slow 360 to take in all the changes. "It's like someone lifted a curse off this place. I can actually breathe in here now." "Tell me about it," I said, cracking open a beer and settling into my new couch. "Want to know the crazy part? I forgot what it felt like to be comfortable in my own house." Logan plopped down next to me, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about someone yelling at us for messing up the carefully arranged cushions. "Dude, I've been waiting for this conversation for so long. Sophie was using you like a human ATM machine, and you were too nice to see it. I saw it. I admit it. I just thought it would get better. Thought maybe if I supported her dreams long enough, she'd remember that I had dreams, too." And now I looked around at my reclaimed living room. My oak table gleaming in the late afternoon sun. My comfortable couch that didn't look like it belonged in a museum. My sound system that could actually handle some decent music. Now I remember what it's like to live for myself instead of someone else's Instagram feed. We spent the evening like we used to back in college, just hanging out and talking without every conversation being interrupted by Sophie's need to document our lives for social media. No ring lights, no carefully staged moments, no pressure to look perfect for an invisible audience. Just two friends, cold beer, and the kind of easy conversation that happens when you're not performing for anyone. "So, what's the plan when she gets back?" Logan asked around midnight after we'd properly christened the new sound system with everything from classic rock to some jazz fusion that would have made Sophie's content creation brain hemorrhage. Honestly, I'm curious to see how long it takes her to figure out that her old life isn't waiting for her anymore. I said she wanted freedom from being embarrassed by me. I'm just making sure she gets all the freedom she can handle. Logan raised his beer in a toast. "To freedom then, and to finally getting your house back." "To getting my life back," I corrected. As Logan headed home and I settled into my new couch for what would be the first real night of sleep I'd had in years, I realized something important. I wasn't just reclaiming my space. I was reclaiming myself. The Marcus who built furniture with his hands, who valued comfort over appearances, who chose substance over style. He'd been buried under 4 years of Sophie's relentless image management. But he wasn't gone. He was just waiting for his chance to rebuild. Tomorrow, I'd continue the transformation, maybe tackle the bedroom or start setting up my workshop again. But tonight, I was just going to enjoy sitting in my own living room, drinking my own beer, listening to my own music without anyone telling me it wasn't photogenic enough. For the first time in years, my house felt like home. You know what's liberating about not having to document every moment of your existence for social media? You actually get to live those moments instead of performing them. While Sophie was busy curating her European adventure for her followers, posting carefully filtered shots of croissants and museum selfies, I was rediscovering what it meant to have experiences that existed purely for their own sake. No ring lights required. The first weekend after Operation House Reclamation, Logan dragged me out to Griffith Park for a hike I'd been putting off for months. Not because I didn't want to go, but because Sophie always had some reason why weekends needed to be spent on her content calendar instead of actual living. We need to film 3 weeks worth of posts, or Clara and Vivian are doing a collaboration and I need to match their aesthetic or my personal favorite. Hiking isn't really on brand for my lifestyle content. Translation: getting sweaty and dirty didn't photograph well for someone trying to sell the fantasy of effortless perfection. But there I was, lacing up my actual hiking boots, not the designer ones Sophie had bought me for a single Instagram post about adventure couple goals, and heading up the trail with Logan like we used to do every weekend before my life became a supporting role in someone else's carefully scripted show. The morning air was crisp. The trail was challenging enough to make me work for it. And best of all, nobody was stopping every 50 yards to find the perfect lighting for a selfie. "This is weird," Logan said about halfway up, pausing to catch his breath at an overlook that gave us a killer view of the city sprawled out below. "What's weird? You're not checking your phone every 5 minutes to see if Sophie needs something, or worrying about getting home by a certain time so she can film her evening routine, or any of that stuff. You're just here." He was right. For the first time in years, I was completely present in a moment instead of mentally managing someone else's schedule and emotional needs. No text messages from Sophie asking me to pick up specific lighting equipment. No last-minute changes to dinner plans because she needed to film a sponsored post about some meal kit service. No pressure to look happy and supportive while she turned our entire life into content for strangers on the internet. After the hike, we grabbed beers at this dive bar in Los Feliz that Sophie would have hated. Too dark for good photos, too authentic for her aesthetic, too much actual character instead of the sanitized perfection she preferred. The kind of place where people went to drink beer and talk to their friends instead of staging elaborate social media moments. Logan and I sat at the bar, ordered whatever was on tap, and spent 3 hours just talking about stuff that mattered to us. Work projects, future plans, that fishing trip we've been talking about for 2 years but never took because Sophie always had some event or collaboration that needed my attention. The crazy part was how good it felt to have conversations that weren't being recorded, weren't going to be dissected later for content possibilities, weren't going to be interrupted by Sophie's need to document everything for her followers. We talked about Logan's promotion at work, my ideas for expanding my carpentry side business, whether the Dodgers had any shot at making the playoffs this year. Normal human conversations that existed purely because we enjoyed each other's company. My phone buzzed a few times with notifications, and I glanced down to see the usual parade of Sophie's European documentation. A perfectly composed shot of her coffee and pastry at some Parisian cafe captioned with something about finding inspiration in the simple moments. Another post from Rome, her and Clara and Vivon posed in front of the Colosseum, all of them wearing coordinated outfits that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Tagged with #living_life and #blessed and a dozen other hashtags designed to make her followers feel like their own lives were inadequate by comparison. The thing that struck me wasn't jealousy or hurt feelings. It was how utterly hollow it all looked. Every photo was so carefully staged, so perfectly lit, so desperately crafted to project an image of happiness and success that it felt completely disconnected from any actual experience. Were they having fun, or were they just working really hard to make it look like they were having fun? When do you cross the line from living your life to performing it for an audience that doesn't actually care about you as a person? And not once, not in a single post, story, or caption. Did Sophie mention missing me or wishing I was there? No. Wish my husband could see this beautiful sunset, or can't wait to share these memories with Marcus when I get home. Nothing. It was like I'd been completely edited out of her narrative, which, let's be honest, was probably exactly what she wanted. I was the unsexy reality behind her glamorous image. The guy who paid the bills and handled the logistics while she focused on looking fabulous for strangers on the internet. The following week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I rejoined my old softball league. These were guys I used to play with every Thursday night until Sophie started scheduling her content creation around my free time. Can't you miss one game? I need you to help me set up for this sponsored post became. Do you really need to play softball when we could be doing something together? Which eventually became me just quietly dropping out because it was easier than dealing with the guilt trips and manipulation. But Marcus 2.00 wasn't interested in managing anyone else's emotional needs at the expense of his own happiness. I showed up to practice on a Thursday evening with my old glove and a cooler full of beer, and it was like no time had passed at all. Same guys, same jokes, same pure joy of playing a game for no reason other than it was fun. No cameras, no performance, no content creation opportunities, just a bunch of middle-aged dudes pretending we were still 22 and could turn a double play without throwing out our backs. After the game, we hit up our usual spot for wings and more beer, and I found myself laughing harder than I had in months. Real laughter, not the careful camera-ready chuckles I'd gotten used to producing whenever Sophie needed me to look happy and supportive in her content. This was the deep belly-shaking kind of laughter that comes from genuine connection and shared experiences that don't need to be documented to be meaningful. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with Sophie's updates from across the ocean: designer shopping in Milan, wine tasting in Tuscany, art museum visits in Amsterdam. Every experience filtered through the lens of how it would play to her audience. Every moment carefully crafted to maintain her brand as someone living an enviable life. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Sophie was working overtime to create the appearance of happiness for people she'd never meet, while I was actually living it with people who cared about me as a human being instead of a content creation assistant. Real life, it turns out, doesn't need good lighting or perfect angles. It just needs to be lived. The night before Sophie's scheduled return, I sat in my reclaimed living room with a beer in one hand and my laptop balanced on the oak coffee table I'd built. The one that was finally back where it belonged. Outside, the Pacific breeze was doing its thing, carrying the smell of salt water through the windows I could actually open now that I didn't have to worry about messing up Sophie's carefully controlled lighting setup. For 3 weeks, I'd been living like a human being instead of a supporting actor in someone else's Instagram story. And let me tell you, the difference was life-changing. But now, it was time for the final act of this little drama. And I wanted to get the tone just right. See, I could have gone the dramatic route, changed the locks, and left her standing on the porch with her overpriced luggage. Maybe thrown in some kind of movie-worthy confrontation for maximum impact. But that's what Sophie would expect because that's the kind of messy emotional theater she thrived on. Drama equals content and content equals attention. And attention was Sophie's drug of choice. No, Marcus 2.0 was going for something much more devastating. Complete professionalism. Cold surgical precision that would cut deeper than any screaming match or thrown dishes. I wanted her to understand exactly what had happened and why without giving her any ammunition for her inevitable victim narrative. This needed to be airtight, legally sound, and utterly final. I opened a new email and started typing. Subject: important information regarding your return. Already, I could picture her reading that subject line and feeling the first flutter of unease. Sophie was expecting "can't wait to see you" or "welcome home baby" or some other supportive husband instead. She was getting the kind of formal communication you'd send to a business partner you were severing ties with. Sophie, I began because I wasn't going to pretend this was still a loving relationship where pet names applied. I hope your trip provided the clarity and perspective you were seeking. I'm writing to inform you of several important changes that have occurred during your absence. The beauty of formal language is how it strips away all the emotional manipulation and gets straight to the facts. No room for misinterpretation. No wiggle room for her to twist my words into something that made her the victim of this story. Your personal belongings have been carefully packed and moved to a climate-controlled storage unit at Safekeep Storage, 1247 Highland Avenue, Manhattan Beach, Unit 47B. The first month has been paid in advance. You'll receive the access code and key from the facility manager during regular business hours. I took a sip of beer and smiled, imagining her face when she read that line. Sophie probably expected to walk back into the house and find everything exactly as she'd left it, like her life was some kind of TV show that got paused while she was away. The idea that actions might have consequences was probably going to come as a genuine shock to her system. The 2023 Cadillac Escalade has been sold back to the dealership as it was titled solely in my name. The proceeds have been deposited into my personal account to offset the expenses incurred during your European vacation. That line was going to sting, and I'm not ashamed to admit I enjoyed writing it. For too long, Sophie had operated under the assumption that my money was our money while her money was her money. Time for a little reality check about how property ownership actually works in the real world. The locks on the house have been changed for security purposes. As the sole owner of the property, I have decided that our living arrangement is no longer sustainable. Short, sweet, and legally bulletproof. I wasn't kicking her out of our house. I was informing a houseguest that their invitation had expired. There's a difference, and that difference was about to become very important if Sophie decided to lawyer up. I understand this may come as a surprise, but I believe your request at the airport that I not walk with you to avoid embarrassment was actually excellent advice. I have decided to take it to its logical conclusion by stepping out of your life entirely. This was the part one was most proud of because it used her own words against her in a way that was both devastating and completely fair. Sophie had made it crystal clear that my presence in her life was a liability to her image. Well, congratulations, sweetheart. Problem solved. You expressed concern about being embarrassed by your association with me. I respect that concern and am taking steps to ensure it never happens again. Consider this my gift to you. The freedom to live your life without the burden of explaining my existence to your social circle. I could practically hear her brain short-circuiting as she read that paragraph. Sophie's whole manipulation strategy depended on me being the understanding, forgiving husband who absorbed her cruelty and came back for more. She'd never encountered a version of me that simply agreed with her assessment and acted accordingly. Please coordinate any future communication through our respective attorneys. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries during this transition. The lawyer mentioned was pure psychological warfare, and I knew it would hit her exactly where it hurt most, her wallet. Sophie had gotten very comfortable spending money she hadn't earned, but hiring legal representation would require resources she didn't actually have access to anymore. Her parents might bail her out, but that would require explaining to Richard and Helen exactly how their daughter had managed to nuke a perfectly stable marriage for the sake of Instagram clout. I wish you success in all your future endeavors. Your influencer career should benefit significantly from no longer being associated with someone who doesn't fit your aesthetic. And there it was, the kill shot delivered with surgical precision. I wasn't angry or hurt or seeking revenge. I was simply a businessman closing out an unprofitable partnership and moving on to better opportunities. The fact that this approach would drive Sophie absolutely insane was just a pleasant bonus. I read through the email one more time, checking for typos and making sure the tone stayed consistently professional. This wasn't a love letter or a breakup note or a plea for reconciliation. This was a termination notice, and I wanted it to read like one. Best regards, Marcus Hale. Not love, not your husband, not even sincerely, just my name. Like I was signing off on a business transaction because that's essentially what this had become. The dissolution of a partnership where one party had been contributing everything and the other had been taking it all for granted. I hit send at 11:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. By the time Sophie's plane touched down at LAX the next morning, she'd have 12 hours to process the new reality of her situation. Then I closed the laptop, finished my beer, and headed upstairs to pack for my own trip. The Rocky Mountains were calling, and for the first time in years, I was free to answer. Picture this. I'm somewhere in the middle of Colorado, cruising through mountain passes on my Harley with nothing but open road ahead of me and 3 bars of cell service when I decide to power up my phone for the first time in 5 days. Big mistake. Or maybe the best decision I'd made all week, depending on how you look at entertainment value. My phone damn near exploded with notifications. We're talking biblical plague levels of missed calls, voicemails, text messages, and what appeared to be a complete social media meltdown spanning multiple platforms. The notification count looked like a slot machine jackpot. 347 missed calls, 89 voicemails, and enough text messages to fill a small novel. All from Sophie, with a supporting cast of her flying monkeys chiming in with their own brand of outrage and disbelief. But the real comedy gold came when Logan called me back. I'd reached out to him that morning because, let's be honest, I needed to know how the homecoming had gone down. Logan didn't disappoint. Dude had front row seats to what he was already calling the meltdown of the century, and he was more than happy to give me the play-by-play. Bro, you should have seen this shit, Logan said. And I could hear him trying not to laugh. I was washing my car in the driveway when the cab pulled up to your house around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sophie gets out looking like she just stepped off the cover of some travel magazine. You know, designer everything, perfect hair, the whole Instagram princess routine. She's got enough luggage for a small army, and she's clearly expecting her grand entrance to go smoothly. I pulled over at a scenic overlook and settled in for what I knew was going to be the story of the year. Tell me she at least tried the key before having a complete breakdown. Oh, she tried the key. All right. Multiple times. I watched her jiggle that handle for a good 5 minutes before it dawned on her that you actually changed the locks like you said you would. That's when things got interesting. Logan paused for dramatic effect. The bastard. He was enjoying this way too much, but honestly, So was I. After 4 years of Sophie's emotional manipulation and public humiliation tactics, the idea of her finally experiencing some consequences was more satisfying than a perfectly grilled steak. So, she starts banging on the door, right? Not just knocking, full-on pounding like the house is on fire. She's yelling, "Marcus, Marcus, I know you're in there." Loud enough that Mrs. Rodriguez came out of her house next door to see what the commotion was about. This goes on for maybe 10 minutes before Sophie finally pulls out her phone and calls you and got my voicemail because I was enjoying the peace and quiet of mountain living. Exactly. So, she leaves this message. I could hear her from my driveway, dude. Where she starts off trying to sound reasonable, like, "Marcus, I'm home. Let's talk about this like adults," but by the end of it, she's practically screaming about how you can't just lock her out of her own house, and she's going to call the police. I had to laugh at that one. Sophie's grasp of property law was about as solid as her understanding of basic human decency. Did she actually call the cops? Oh, she called them. All right. 2 patrol cars showed up about an hour later. I made myself busy in the front yard so I could watch the whole thing go down. The officers were actually pretty professional about it. They listened to her whole sob story about being locked out, asked to see some ID, and then politely explained that since her name isn't on the deed, and she doesn't have any legal documentation proving residency, there wasn't really anything they could do. How'd she take that news? About as well as you'd expect. Started crying, talking about how this was all some terrible misunderstanding, how you were just upset and you'd work it out like you always do. The cops basically told her it was a civil matter and suggested she contact a lawyer if she felt her rights were being violated. Then they left and that's when the real show started. I could picture the whole scene playing out in my quiet suburban neighborhood. Sophie's carefully constructed image crumbling in front of an audience of concerned neighbors and curious onlookers. After years of presenting herself as the perfect wife living the perfect life, having a public breakdown on my front porch was probably her worst nightmare. She spent the next 2 hours calling everyone in her contact list. Logan continued, and I mean everyone. I could hear her leaving increasingly desperate voicemails, talking to her parents, trying to reach Clara and Vivian. But here's the kicker. None of her rich friends answered their phones. Not one. Clara and Vivan, who she'd been posting pictures with just 24 hours earlier, suddenly became unreachable the moment she actually needed help. That part didn't surprise me at all. Clara and Vivian were fair-weather friends at best. The kind of people who enjoyed Sophie's company when it came with expensive restaurants and Instagram-worthy adventures, but who'd vanish the second things got messy or inconvenient. They'd probably seen her post from the airport and decided that associating with someone having a public breakdown wasn't good for their own carefully managed images. So, what happened next? Her parents finally called her back around 5 o'clock. Richard sounded pissed. I could hear him yelling through the phone from across the street. Helen was crying in the background. Took them about 2 hours to drive down from Ventura. And by the time they got there, Sophie had worked herself into a complete state. Logan paused to take a drink of something. Probably beer. Definitely earned. Marcus, I'm talking full-blown hysterics. She's sitting on her suitcase in the middle of your front porch, mascara running down her face, hair a mess, crying so hard she's hyperventilating, all while posting about it on her Instagram story, by the way, because apparently even a mental breakdown needs to be documented for content. You're kidding me. Dead serious. She's filming herself crying, talking about betrayal and abandonment, the whole victim narrative. But here's the thing, her follower count was actually dropping while she was posting. People were unfollowing her in real time as they watched this meltdown happen. I guess watching your aspirational lifestyle guru have a public breakdown kind of ruins the fantasy. The mental image of Sophie Liv tweeting her own destruction while sitting on a suitcase was almost too perfect to believe. After years of curating every moment of her life for maximum impact, she couldn't stop performing. Even when her world was falling apart, it was like watching someone try to direct their own disaster movie. When her parents finally showed up, Richard was beyond furious. Logan continued, I heard him ask her what the hell she'd done to make you change the locks, and Sophie just kept saying it was all a misunderstanding, that you were being dramatic, that you'd never actually follow through on leaving her. Helen was trying to calm everyone down, but you could tell she was mortified. Having your daughter's marriage implode in public view isn't exactly what any parent dreams of. Did they try to get into the house? Richard knocked on the door a few times, but when nobody answered, he seemed to figure out pretty quickly that you weren't home. Smart guy, your father-in-law. He loaded Sophie's luggage into their car and basically dragged her away from the scene before she could embarrass herself any further. But not before she left you about 50 more voicemails. I scrolled through my phone while Logan talked, looking at the tsunami of notifications Sophie had generated. The voicemail started reasonable and rapidly devolved into desperation, anger, bargaining, and finally what sounded like complete emotional collapse. It was like listening to the 5 stages of grief compressed into real-time audio format. The best part, Logan said, clearly saving his favorite detail for last, was watching all her neighbors peek out their windows and front doors during the whole spectacle. Your quiet little street got more drama in one afternoon than it usually sees in a decade. Mrs. Rodriguez was taking pictures from behind her curtains. The college kids across the street were recording videos. Sophie's breakdown is probably going to end up on someone's TikTok. That thought should have made me feel bad for her. But honestly, Sophie had spent years turning our private life into public content. Broadcasting our relationship for anyone with an internet connection to judge and comment on. Having her meltdown become someone else's entertainment seemed like poetic justice. How long did the whole thing last from the time she got out of the cab until her parents dragged her away? About 4 hours of pure chaos. And Marcus, I got to tell you, it was the most entertaining afternoon I've had in years. Better than cable. I thanked Logan for the detailed report and promised to buy him dinner when I got back from my road trip. As I ended the call and looked out over the Colorado landscape, mountains stretching to the horizon, clean air, absolute peace and quiet, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete satisfaction. Sophie had wanted freedom from being embarrassed by me. Mission accomplished. She was now free to be embarrassed entirely by her own actions. Nothing says I've completely lost control of my life. Quite like having your parents hire a lawyer to threaten your ex-husband with legal action. That's exactly what greeted me when I rolled back into Manhattan Beach after 2 weeks of the most peaceful road trip I'd taken in years. My mailbox contained the usual collection of bills, junk mail, and one very official-looking envelope from the law offices of Patterson, Burke, and Associates. Apparently, Richard and Helen's attorney of choice for their daughter's latest crisis. The letter was a masterpiece of legal posturing and empty threats, the kind of document that sounds scary if you don't know anything about actual law, but falls apart under even casual scrutiny. It was signed by someone named Jennifer Patterson, Esquire, who'd clearly been fed a very one-sided version of events and was now demanding everything from spousal support to restitution for emotional distress to my personal favorite, return of all marital assets to their proper shared status. I sat on my back patio with a beer and read through the whole thing twice, alternating between laughter and genuine amazement at the sheer audacity of it all. Sophie had apparently convinced her parents and their lawyer that I was some kind of financial abuser who'd stolen her belongings and illegally locked her out of the marital home. The letter demanded immediate access to the house, restoration of her rightful ownership of the SUV I'd sold, and compensation for damages to her professional reputation and earning capacity. The funniest part was the threat at the end. Failure to comply with these reasonable demands within 10 business days will result in immediate legal action to protect our client's interests and recover all damages sustained as a result of your unconscionable conduct. Unconscionable conduct. I love that phrase. Apparently, taking control of my own property and refusing to fund someone's lifestyle after they publicly humiliated me qualified as unconscionable conduct in the Patterson, Burke, and Associates universe. Lucky for me, I had Graham Morrison on speed dial. Graham had been my attorney since I bought the house. A straight-talking guy in his 60s who specialized in real estate and family law and had zero patience for legal. When I called him that afternoon and read him Patterson's letter over the phone, I could practically hear him rolling his eyes through the receiver. "Marcus, this is amateur hour stuff," Graham said. "They're making demands they have no legal basis for and threats they can't follow through on. Your wife's name isn't on the house deed. The car was titled in your name only. And last I checked, changing the locks on your own property isn't a criminal act. What exactly do they think they're going to sue you for? Apparently, I'm guilty of unconscionable conduct." "Right. Well, let me draft a response that'll educate Miss Patterson about what unconscionable conduct actually looks like." Graham's letter, which arrived at Patterson Burke and Associates 3 days later via certified mail, was a thing of beauty. Where their letter had been all bluster and empty threats, Graham's response was surgical in its precision and devastating in its implications. He started with the basics. A copy of the house deed showing sole ownership in my name, the car title proving sole ownership in my name, and documentation of all the joint accounts that had been legally closed with appropriate notice. Then he got to the fun part. Graham had itemized every expense I'd covered during our marriage that Sophie had never contributed to. Mortgage payments, property taxes, utilities, insurance, car payments, maintenance, repairs, and my personal favorite, the $18,000 I'd spent funding her European vacation and the lifestyle content that preceded it. He presented it all in a neat spreadsheet that showed Sophie had essentially been living rentier in my house while I subsidized her influencer career to the tune of roughly $75,000 over 4 years. But the rail kill shot came in the final paragraph. Mr. Hale welcomes your client's proposed lawsuit and is prepared to file an immediate counterclaim for unjust enrichment, conversion of services, and compensation for 4 years of uncompensated financial support. We estimate damages in the range of $200,000 plus attorney fees and court costs. Additionally, we have documented evidence of your client's public defamation campaign against Mr. Hale across multiple social media platforms which may constitute additional grounds for legal action. We encourage your client to carefully consider whether pursuing litigation is in her best interest. Graham had attached screenshots of Sophie's most unhinged social media posts, her deleted website content, and even some of the comments from Clara and Vivon that could be considered defamatory. The message was clear. If Sophie wanted to play legal hardball, she was going to discover that she'd brought a water gun to a rocket launcher fight. The response from Patterson Burke and Associates was swift and telling. Complete silence. No phone calls, no follow-up letters, no scheduled depositions or settlement conferences, just radio silence from a law firm that had apparently realized their client had no case and a whole lot of potential liability. I imagine Jennifer Patterson, Esquire, had some very uncomfortable conversations with Richard and Helen about the difference between what Sophie had told them and what the actual legal facts looked like. Sophie's social media presence, meanwhile, had evolved from frantic victim narrative to sporadic depression posting. Gone were the angry rants about betrayal and abandonment, replaced by vague inspirational quotes about new beginnings and finding yourself after toxic relationships. Her follower count continued to hemorrhage, dropping from over 50,000 to somewhere in the low 20s and falling fast. Clara and Vivon had completely ghosted her by this point, their own social media feeds conspicuously free of any mention of their former travel companion. Apparently, supporting your friend through a dramatic breakup was one thing, but associating with someone who was threatening legal action and posting erratically was bad for the personal brand. The best part was watching Sophie's content quality deteriorate in real time. Without the house as a backdrop, the designer clothes, the expensive lifestyle accessories, and most importantly, without my financial support, her posts looked increasingly desperate and amateur. She was trying to maintain the aspirational lifestyle guru aesthetic while clearly operating on a shoestring budget and probably living in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house. Logan kept me updated on the neighborhood gossip, reporting that Sophie had been spotted a few times driving by the house in her parents' old Honda Civic, presumably hoping to catch me home so she could attempt some kind of reconciliation. But I'd learned my lesson about predictable patterns. I varied my schedule, parked in different spots, and generally made myself unavailable for any dramatic confrontations. The silence from her legal team spoke volumes about the strength of her position, or lack thereof. When lawyers go quiet after making big threats, it usually means they've discovered their client has been less than truthful about the facts and they don't want to end up sanctioned by the court for filing frivolous lawsuits. 3 weeks after Graham's response letter, I got a call from Jennifer Patterson herself. Not a threatening demand or legal ultimatum, but a polite inquiry about whether I might be interested in discussing a mutually beneficial resolution to this matter outside of litigation. Translation: Sophie's parents had probably gotten the legal bill for their attorney's research into my actual position, realized their daughter had painted them a completely fictional version of events, and were now looking for a way to make this all go away without spending their retirement fund on a lawsuit they couldn't win. I told Patterson I'd consider any reasonable proposal, but that my position hadn't changed. Sophie was welcome to her belongings from storage, but everything else was final. No money, no house access, no reconciliation discussions. The call ended with Patterson promising to discuss options with her client and get back to me. That was 6 weeks ago, and I haven't heard from them since. Sometimes silence is the most eloquent response of all, for months. That's how long it took for Sophie's carefully constructed world to completely collapse and for my life to transform from supporting actor in someone else's drama to the starring role in my own story. For months since that morning at LAX when she told me not to walk with her because I'd embarrass her in front of her rich friends. For months since I decided to take her advice and step out of her life entirely. And what a 4 months it had been. I was sitting in my workshop, my actual workshop, not Sophie's former content creation studio, putting the finishing touches on a custom dining table I'd been commissioned to build for a client in Rundo Beach. The guest room had been completely transformed back into the space I'd always wanted. Workbenches along the walls, proper lighting for detailed work, tools organized exactly the way I liked them, and the smell of wood stain and sawdust that meant I was doing something real with my hands instead of just funding someone else's Instagram fantasies. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was making more money from my carpentry side business in 4 months than Sophie had ever earned from her influencer career. Turns out people actually pay good money for furniture that's built to last instead of just look good in photos. Who would have thought? Logan stopped by that afternoon with updates on Sophie's continuing downward spiral, which had become our monthly entertainment ritual. He'd grab a couple of beers from my fridge. I'd finish whatever project I was working on, and he'd fill me in on the latest developments in the Sophie Hale catastrophe tour. "So, get this," Logan said, settling into the comfortable chair I'd built specifically for the workshop. "My cousin Jennifer works at that fancy gallery in Santa Monica, right? Mitchell's place. She told me Sophie showed up there last week trying to sell herself as an interior designer." "You're kidding me." "Dead serious. Apparently, she walked in with a portfolio of photos from your old house. You know, back when she had it all staged for her Instagram posts and tried to convince Mitchell that she was some kind of design consultant. She wanted him to recommend her to his wealthy clients for home staging and decor consulting." I had to laugh at the pure audacity of it. Sophie was trying to monetize the aesthetic she'd imposed on my house. The same aesthetic that had turned my home into a sterile photography studio. How'd that go over? About as well as you'd expect. Mitchell took one look at her portfolio, recognized the house from when he'd visited you last year, and basically laughed her out of the gallery. Then he called me to make sure you knew about it. His exact words were, "Marcus, you dodged a bullet. A big expensive fake bullet." That was Mitchell for you. Art gallery owner, straight shooter, and someone who could spot a fake from a mile away. He'd been to a couple of dinner parties at the house back when Sophie was still playing the perfect wife role, and I could tell even then that he saw right through her act. "But wait, it gets better," Logan continued. "Jennifer said Sophie tried to argue with Mitchell about her professional experience and artistic vision. She actually pulled out her phone and started showing him her Instagram posts as proof of her design credentials. Mitchell asked her if she had any formal training, any actual clients, or any examples of work she'd done for other people. When she couldn't answer any of those questions, he suggested she might want to consider a different career path. The mental image of Sophie trying to convince a respected gallery owner that her Instagram feed qualified as professional experience was almost too perfect. It was like watching someone try to become a chef based solely on their restaurant selfies. "So, what's she doing now?" I asked, not because I really cared about Sophie's welfare, but because her continued poor decision-making had become a source of genuine entertainment. Living with her parents, as far as anyone can tell, her social media presence has basically dried up to nothing. Maybe one post a week, usually some recycled motivational quote about new beginnings or finding your true self. Her follower count is down to something like 15,000. And most of those are probably bots or people who forgot to unfollow. 15,000. I remembered when Sophie hit 50,000 followers and threw herself a celebration party that cost more than most people's cars. She talked about reaching a 100,000 like it was her destiny, her ticket to real influencer success. Now she was posting to an audience smaller than a decent high school football game and shrinking fast. Clara and Vivian gone. Completely ghosted her. I heard from Dave's girlfriend that Clara actually unfriended Sophie on Facebook last month. These were supposed to be her closest friends, the women she traveled to Europe with, and they dropped her the second she became inconvenient. That tracked perfectly with what I'd observed about Sophie's social circle. They were all about the image, the lifestyle, the Instagram-worthy moments. The second things got messy or real or complicated, they vanished like morning fog. Sophie had built her entire social life around people who saw her as an accessory to their own brands. And when she stopped being useful, they moved on without a backward glance. What about her parents? Richard and Helen are apparently not thrilled with their new permanent house guest. My neighbor's sister works at the bank where Helen does their accounting. And word is they're not exactly happy about funding Sophie's lifestyle while she figures things out, especially after they got the bill from that lawyer who accomplished absolutely nothing except proving Sophie lied to them about what actually happened. I felt a tiny pang of sympathy for Richard and Helen. They weren't bad people, just parents who'd enabled their daughter's worst impulses and were now dealing with the consequences. Having a 30-something daughter moved back home after spectacularly destroying her marriage probably wasn't how they'd planned to spend their golden years. The workshop door opened and my neighbor Tom poked his head in. "Marcus, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to let you know that woman was by again yesterday." "Sophie, yeah, same routine as last time. Drove by real slow in that beat-up Honda, parked across the street for maybe 20 minutes, then left when Mrs. Rodriguez came out to get her mail. I don't think she's trying to cause trouble. Just I don't know. Maybe hoping to run into you." I thanked Tom and made a mental note to vary my schedule even more. The last thing I needed was an awkward confrontation in my own driveway, especially since I'd heard through the grapevine that Sophie was telling people we were just taking a break and would work things out eventually. Denial was apparently another stage of grief and Sophie seemed to be camping out there indefinitely. Later that evening, I was planning my next adventure, a 3-week trip to Southeast Asia that I'd been researching for months. Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Places I'd always wanted to visit, but never could because Sophie's content calendar always took priority over actual travel experiences. Now I could go anywhere I wanted, stay as long as I liked, and experience it all without having to document every moment for social media. The freedom was intoxicating in a way I hadn't expected. Not just the financial freedom, though having control over my own money again was definitely nice. And not just the physical freedom, though being able to make decisions without consulting someone else's brand strategy was liberating. It was the mental freedom that really got to me. The ability to think my own thoughts, make my own choices, and live my own life without constantly worrying about how it would affect someone else's image. I pulled out my laptop and started booking flights, hotels, and experiences that appealed to me personally rather than what would photograph well. Cooking classes in Hanoi, temple visits in Siem Reap, beach time in southern Thailand. All chosen because I genuinely wanted to do them, not because they'd generate good content for an audience I'd never meet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a second, I wondered if Sophie had gotten a new phone and was trying to reach me, but it turned out to be Mitchell from the gallery. Marcus, hope you don't mind the text. Wanted to let you know I have a client interested in commissioning some custom pieces. Saw photos of your work at Logan's place and wants to discuss a project. Good money if you're interested. Also, your ex-wife stopped by again today asking about business opportunities. Thought you should know. I smiled and typed back a quick response confirming my interest in the commission work. It felt good to be building something real, something that would last, something that had value beyond its appearance in a photograph. Sophie had always dismissed my carpentry as a hobby, something that got in the way of her more important pursuits. Now it was becoming a legitimate business, while her important pursuits had evaporated into irrelevance. That night, I sat on my back patio with a beer, looking out at the Pacific Ocean and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. For months ago, I'd been a supporting character in Sophie's carefully scripted life. The reliable husband who showed up when needed and faded into the background when convenient. Now, I was the protagonist of my own story, making choices based on what I wanted rather than what looked good for someone else's brand. Sophie had gotten exactly what she asked for that morning at the airport. She'd wanted freedom from being embarrassed by me, and I'd given her complete freedom from my presence in her life. She'd wanted to live without having to explain my existence to her social circle. And now she never had to mention me again. She'd wanted the space to be the glamorous, unattached lifestyle guru she thought she was meant to be. And I'd cleared every obstacle to that dream. The fact that she discovered she was neither glamorous nor capable of maintaining her lifestyle without my financial support wasn't my problem anymore. The fact that her social circle had abandoned her the moment things got complicated wasn't my responsibility to fix. The fact that her influencer career had collapsed under the weight of her own poor decisions wasn't something I needed to feel guilty about. I'd simply taken her at her word and acted accordingly. She'd shown me exactly how little she valued our relationship, and I'd responded by removing myself from it entirely. Clean, professional, final. As I finished my beer and headed inside to continue planning my Southeast Asian adventure, I realized something important. For the first time in years, I was genuinely excited about my future. Not nervous, not uncertain, not dependent on someone else's approval or support, just excited about all the possibilities that lay ahead. Sophie had thought she was married to someone who would always be there, always forgive, always support her regardless of how she treated him. What she'd actually been married to was someone who'd been taking notes, building his own life, and waiting for the right moment to step away from hers. She'd wanted a life that looked good online. I'd wanted a life that felt good in reality. In the end, she chose the image, and I chose the substance. And I was living proof that substance beats image every single time.